Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
And this is really a call to action.
Details on that action plan in this week's Capitol Report. Hello everyone, thanks for watching Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. A few weeks ago, current and former state leaders spent several hours at the Capitol seeking ideas and input on short and long-term solutions to the budget crisis that plagues Minnesota. The creation of a new subcommittee to discuss the potential budget solutions was one result of the summit. It was announced by Senate Majority Leader Larry Poggemiller, who will co-chair that committee, and Speaker Margaret Anderson Kelleher. They, along with Governor Al Quie and former Congressman Martin Sabo, released additional recommendations on September 28th at the Capitol. Before we get to the latest on the summit recommendations, we want to take you back to where it all began. Room 112 at the state capitol was the center of Creative Comments. A presentation by state economist Tom Stinson and state demographer Tom Gillespie points to several concerns, including previous unsustainable tax cuts and ongoing spending commitments, an aging and diverse population leading to more public services and decreased state revenue to pay for those services, increased health care costs, and a state economy that lagged behind the nation from 2004 through 2007, and it is expected to continue this trend or, at best, match the nation's economy. Now, it was made clear during the summit that Minnesota cannot grow its way out of the recession, which precipitated conversation at the table on what it takes to turn things around. Some ideas were a little vague, others more concrete. We begin with Governor Arne Carlson and his thoughts on where we are heading as a state and how to get back on track.
It ends, if you will, on a bit of a pessimistic note. And all of us participated in the past. And I sense from your presentation that what the bottom line is that we are closing one chapter of how we do business. And if we continue to try to extend the way we have been doing business, we can only expect an increased amount of pain. But on the other hand, with the closing of that chapter, it also opens up some opportunities for some new thought. And frankly, on a political basis, it gives great opportunities to both political parties to start to rethink. First of all, what comes to my mind is, one, extending the retirement age. Seriously, look around this table. All of us have aged over the past 20 years. That's fairly obvious. But on the other hand, should we automatically relegate people to retirement at an arbitrary age, which frankly makes no longer any sense? So that's something for us to start to think about, because most people, frankly, can ill afford to retire. And that is creating a certain amount of impoverishment among elderly people and a dependency which government, frankly, cannot afford. So it's time for us to think about the retirement age. Secondly, the health issue. You know, we bandied this about in a very delicate fashion, but the truth of the matter is enormous savings can occur if we as a society focus on good health. That's the honest truth. I went back to my alma mater and talked about prevention of health, and it was the doctors in the room, Harvard trained, that ridiculed the notion. That's how deep we are into the rut that health care is strictly an after effect as opposed to a preventative item. And so we as a society have to start to rethink schools without proper exercise program, schools without proper nutrition programs, schools where the nutrition program is a dumping ground, if you will, for agricultural surplus regardless of the impact it has on children. Or certain kinds of foods being fed to children that we know are harmful to the children, but they make money for the school. So we have to start to learn to prioritize, if you will, in a different way. Thirdly, and one of the things that we barely touched upon here, you can produce as many products as you want and you can produce them efficiently as much as you want, but if you don't have a market and a growing market, all of that will be stalled. And one of the things we have to start to rethink, both as an American society and as a participant in global affairs, is what do we do to create new markets and empower more people to participate in the purchasing power? And that's an opportunity that business would absolutely adore, but there's no reason why government should continue to ignore it. Those prospects are absolutely enormous, and were we to create new markets, those charts would dramatically change. We also have to, from a budgetary perspective, because we're very loose in how we use our verbiage, but one is to design budgets that tell us truly what is your investment piece and what is your maintenance piece. And the bottom line of your message is that the maintenance piece is becoming so dominant that there's very little room any longer for investment, and investment is your key to the future. So bingo, the chapter of pessimism obviously comes forth. But if we can learn to create a different approach to budgeting, and not simply say that everything we do is an investment, but rather really start to programmatically affect true investment. Governor Anderson touched on the University of Minnesota. Well, the university is a key part of that engine. And can we target money from government to those research engines that will allow us to grow our economy a lot faster than we can possibly anticipate today? A third part is something that, oddly enough, we discussed back in the 1970s, particularly in the state Senate. It ruptured into an entire special session, and Governor Anderson, your whole reputation was based on the failure of the value-added tax debate.
Not my failure.
No, not yours. But we Republicans got embroiled in that one. But you know what? It's time to start to revisit it. Instead of worrying about how you can milk more out of the sales tax, out of the income tax, etc., we should start thinking about what it is that we want from a social perspective a tax system to accomplish, and one of them is to put pressure on consumption. And it may be well for the United States and for states as a whole to start to have a dialogue on the value-added tax, which of course is the common source of revenue in Europe. But it gives us an opportunity to at least open that door and visit with it. The final thing I would say is, when you talked about productivity, a large part of productivity comes from incentives. And frankly, we in government are very guilty of having incentives at cross purposes. And so maybe it's time to take the ship out of the harbor, bring it up into dry dock, and start scraping off all the old barnacles and see if we can't have a more effective ship that has incentives that are truly focused to increasing productivity, but also increasing investment, which becomes a self-sustaining part of economic growth. But I applaud what you brought forth, and I do think there is an optimistic note that it suggests, and that is the opportunity for those of you that are currently in power to start very thoughtfully prior to session, continuing this kind of session, to explore all these various opportunities. And I think, frankly, there's a way to excite Minnesotans to the prospect that maybe we'll be the first state that is actually taking a look at the new horizons.
We essentially have a $6 to $7 billion problem that the next governor is going to face. To say we're not going to cut spending is irresponsible, and I tell people that. To say that we're only going to tax the rich is irresponsible, and I'm trying to get all the Democratic people to understand that. Somewhere in between lies the solution. And so how do we have that public discussion so that the campaign is responsive to what should happen?
If Minnesota had the same tax on cigarettes as over in Wisconsin, pack of cigarettes, Martin, it would produce in a biennium $250 million. Now, if you had $250 million and you put it into pre-kindergarten and K through 12 and research, wouldn't that be better than keeping the tax low so people can smoke more inexpensively?
The only thing I can see that everybody can be a part of it is to expand the goods and some services that have the income tax on it. It's going to hurt some people, but you will always need that. That's not something you do temporarily. So now, how do you do that? And so I've been thinking of it to the two leaders here. I've been working with the governor, and this is the first time anybody ever talked about the present governor, which I was hoping none of us would to any way harm him. But he proposed that there be a 50% reduction in the corporate income tax in 6 years to give hope to corporations to establish here and to grow here. And boy, in the 2010 session, I think it would be worth your effort to trade a reduction in 6 years of the corporate income tax for an expansion of the sales tax.
Expand the sales tax. Assumption there, gee, add clothing? You're hurting the poor. Well, back in the days when I chaired the tax committee, the Suits Index showed that if you added clothing, you had a less regressive sales tax. I assume that's probably still the case. Adding services or a VAT makes a lot of sense, but from one who was there at one point trying to add services, it is not going to be easy. So again, I thank you very much for putting this together and for all the good heads that are here today.
We've gotten a lot of historical information about what the amount of spending has been, what the amount of revenues have been that have been generated over a long period of time. We don't actually talk at all about the effectiveness of those expenditures. Which is an interesting question. You know, is the dollar spent today on K-12 education achieving the same result as it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago? And is there something about our own decision-making process about the allocation of resources that can be enhanced by thinking about how to improve the effectiveness of every dollar spent or the return on investment for every dollar spent?
You are watching a sampling of ideas that were provided at the Leadership Summit with the intent of addressing the state's budget crisis. Now, as those ideas surfaced, so did discussions on broader issues, from policy to politics. Here are some of those comments and concerns.
And this is my last point. Beforehand, you have to have a blueprint of where you're going for the long pull. I mean, the long pull. And I don't think you can do it the way you're presently organized. You just got too many committees. Members have 5 committees to go to. And I've been shocked since I've been up around there a while now because of that work on the constitutional amendment. Members are dependent too much on somebody else telling them what to do. I think a member should be only on one committee and possibly the most 2 and become experts in that area.
I would argue that as much as I would like to have the K-12 system take the full credit for that, that there are others who have responsibility earlier for providing the foundation. I haven't looked at Minneapolis public school statistics for about 5 years, but I can tell you what they looked like 5 years ago. When kids came to school ready for school, regardless of their race, regardless of any other demographic, if they were ready for school, they had a chance to succeed. If they came to school and they weren't ready for school, the system had a heck of a time helping them catch up. If the gap existed on the day they arrived, closing the gap became almost impossible. And so the support system for kids prior to the time that they get to the K-12 system that helps them prepare to be successful becomes very important. Now, of course, that's labeled in our current budget as Health and Human Services mostly, a little bit pre-K, whatever that means, but it is the part of our infrastructure that provides support for kids, like having a roof over their head, having parents who have a job and can devote time to parenting, and having some measure of a sense of safety and the hope that Speaker Anderson Kelleher refers to is critical to their being ready for school. And if they're not ready for school, I think the evidence is pretty clear that the system as we know it today has trouble helping them catch up. The system's changed a lot. Part of it is about teaching, because when Minnesota enjoyed its glory years in K-12 public education, we were dealing with a homogeneous population of people, and teachers could teach to the middle, and kids on top didn't get much extra, and kids on the bottom didn't get much extra, but overall the numbers looked pretty good because everybody was in the middle. Our population is more diverse. Teachers have to individualize instruction more. We're dealing with more cultural issues and different sets of cultural values, so part of it is about the system changing. But even if the system changes, if the kids aren't ready when they show up at the schoolhouse door, the system has a very difficult time coping with that. So maybe, to go back to Governor Carlson's point, part of it is about how we label things and how we measure things if we're really going to affect big changes for the long term. We maybe need to have a longer conversation about what it is we're really trying to do.
The only way we're going to seriously ratchet down the healthcare growth in this nation and in this state is for people to accept the personal responsibility. Chronic disease drives 75% of healthcare spending. Most of those are preventable. All of them can be managed better. And somehow, some way in this debate, we've got to get some personal responsibility back into it as it relates to healthcare costs. That's the true reform in healthcare.
I agree with you, Senator Moe, in the healthcare debate. I'll be critical. Have you heard anyone in this healthcare debate talk about personal responsibility? It's always your fault. It's your fault, whatever it is I have. And until we get to, no, it's my responsibility, I don't think we're going to change health care. And subsequently, what I said, and I'll be criticized, we're exchanging our health care budget for education budget. Just look at the graph. Look at the graph, what's happening. Now, is that to minimize the elderly and to the sick and disabled? No. But I think there are some things we can do to promote that. So to the four of you who hold an election certificate and have called us together, speak the truth, stick to your guns, value education, value jobs and productivity, I think. And finally, give young people of this state a reason to be hopeful.
The new generation of governance is collaborative governance. We've watched now for some time what 50% plus one will give you. It'll give you public policy as long as the 50% plus one is there. Then you're going to have something else. And so I think legislators have to do more of what governors did, which was to convene. And the problem, the difficulty for legislators to do that is you have to invite people who you probably don't want to invite, number one, and then you have to adopt a neutral position, which is difficult for legislators to do, and to allow the group to develop some outcomes focused on certain goals.
I would argue that the most important policy debate that occurs happens on the campaign trail. It's sometimes hard to sort out what portion of that is intelligent conversation and what portion is not. But my own experience has been that people running for office tell the voters what they're going to do. And if the voters elect them, they take that as the voters' blessing to do what they said they were going to do, and contrary to the widespread public belief, they actually try to do what they said they were going to do. They don't suddenly change course. And so I, on the one hand, almost sort of fear that the next opportunity for a true widespread public discussion about the policy questions might not be until the campaign trail of 2010.
We can talk about what we should do, but in a political sense, we need to talk about what we can do. And what we collectively as a society and as a culture, and you do as legislative leaders, and the governor and the next governor and the governor after that can do, is bounded in some sense by what the public is willing to accept. I think as we go into the discussion of the factionalism that has become more apparent in recent years here, is we end up, if the public's a bell curve, we listened to the people on the 10% and the edges rather than the 80% in the middle. I've had some experiences since I left here that has given me great confidence in the ability of the public, an informed public, to make wise decisions. I think their collective wisdom is very strong when you listen to them all.
Doggone it, when you get that election certificate, you're entrusted with the public's business. It's the public's business for the good of the order. And that takes courage. And popularity gets set aside. I think the state of Minnesota now is hungry and has a huge appetite for the discussion that's taking place here today as we go forward in the many venues and interests of all the things we have talked about.
And in the short term, I don't see a lot that's going to get accomplished, especially like in the 2010 legislative session. But when you think about the information that we got today about the longer-term challenges that the state is facing, a suggestion I would have is that you might want to think about spending a good part of that 2010 session educating your colleagues and educating the public about those long-term challenges. For those who were around when the flexible sessions were first established, in my understanding, it was never meant to pass a new budget or to examine every issue that might be on someone's agenda. So that I think if you go back to that notion of using that even-yeared session in some creative ways, in this case, it might be just to get everybody on the same page, understanding the problem. Then you can go into the campaign part of the calendar year next year, talking about whatever solutions you might have. It's not that you're going to come out of the session agreeing on everything, but if everybody understands and can hopefully have a better level of understanding on the part of the public what those challenges are, that is what could take you to a point, say, in 2011 and beyond, that you can seriously look at how you're going to address.
And the thought behind this whole summit was to take advantage of the limited time we have prior to 2010-11. That's the whole purpose. And I think we got to figure out a scheme that says, look, how do we get everybody to the table? Don't leave anybody off the hook. What I would suggest at least the leadership consider is that all four caucuses draft some guidelines relative to how they intend to deal with the crisis, let's just say for the sake of discussion, in the $6 billion range. You can either cut spending, increase revenues, or come up with a lot of creative innovations that can be implemented in time for that budgetary cycle. Those are basically your options. I'm taking borrowing off the table because I think we can all agree that short-term borrowing simply downgrades our credit rating. Likewise, the governor. Now you have 5 plans. Take those 5 plans and market them to the people. You haven't done anything definitive. You haven't agreed upon a budget. You simply set out some parameters. That automatically governs the debate of the election, which is what you want. You don't want candidates running around saying, gee, I don't believe forecasts, therefore elect me and I'll guarantee you there'll be no tax increases, or the reverse, no spending cuts, or whatever it may be. What you want is to maximize flexibility and to get public opinion to the point where they don't buy in to that fringe 10%. That's what you really want. And then you want the discussion to engage the spending systems. They have to be part of the solution. So all of a sudden now you've got 5 separate guidelines. You can send them out to all the constituent groups you want. You can say, hey, I'm sorry, I did not invent this tsunami. I just know it's coming. Now, what do all of us want to do? That's what a democracy is. And the honest truth is, some people who show extraordinarily good leadership may well be punished by the voters. That's a distinct possibility. But more often than not, The public truly admires those people who are candid with them and will even elect them if they don't agree on the solution. At least they have an answer. I don't think evasion is good leadership.
It took less than a month for leaders to come forth with a list of strategies to address the budget challenges. The subcommittee on a balanced budget has now been formed and will begin to discuss these recommendations, which include a blend of tax increases and spending decreases, creating and maintaining a budget reserve, and not spending more than revenues raised during a budget cycle.
The message is simple. There's a big problem in the state. There's a short-term problem of a very big deficit for 2011 and changing dynamics that make the long-term budget problems difficult. And that's going to involve lots of tough choices. And the sooner the state gets about dealing with those problems, the better. So the problem is serious, and it's crucial that we get an early start in finding solutions, which clearly has to be done with involvement of both the legislative and executive branch.
There's an opportunity in the legislative session of 2010 for the legislature and hopefully the governor to solve some of our problems, because there's two things that need to be done in order to balance the budget. One is to get enough revenue in, and also to make sure the spending doesn't go above that, which is that basic last principle that you have in the statement. But the most important of all, that we shouldn't let this time go by because of the conflict between people's opinions.
Has to be all hands on deck. And for my part, let me just say, I know I will have to support reductions in this budget that I would not have supported in my career previously. I know that to be a fact, based on the size of this deficit. Governor Carlson's quote, I think, is a pretty good one. He says, in 2010, you can't simply say we took the Titanic. This set of leaders now can't say we took the Titanic within 200 yards of the iceberg, and now we're giving over the change of command and saying good luck. That would not be the responsible thing to do.
The other thing that is very important about the statement that the leaders have released here is that this is also a process of Minnesotans kind of learning together about the size of our budget problems and kind of what the options are going forward. Everyone in this state wants to have a successful and prosperous state, but budget instability threatens that prosperity and threatens the ability to make key investments that people really want.
The list of recommendations contained the signatures of 12 summit participants, including 3 former governors. And if you want to see more of the summit or the leadership news conference from the past week, just log on to senate.mn. That's going to do it for this week's Capitol Report from all of us here at Senate Media Services. I'm Julie Bartkey. Thanks for watching.